Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Democracy and Education panel. Today we'll be talking about some legal issues and democracy issues in education in the Middle East. And our first speaker, Dr. Ilan Fuchs, teaches in the Legal Studies program at American Military University. He is a scholar of international law and legal history. And he's well published. He's going to be speaking today on a futuristic model of Libya's democracy.
No, that would be
Bashar, sorry. Changes in Haredi education, a comparative perspective from the United States. He's going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we'll ask some questions. So if Ilan, if you would like to go ahead and get started, and we welcome you to the panel.
Thank you, Donna, so much, and thank you everybody that came. I'm going to share a screen just with the PowerPoint. So here we go, and here we go. So this is a project. Let me just begin. Give some credit where credit is due. This is a project which I am doing now as part of some work I'm doing at the Mandel Foundation at Brandeis University. This project, which is at its ending stage, deals with changes in Haredi education. For those of you who are not familiar, I'm referring to a specific segment within Jewish population, sometimes in English referred to as, using a somewhat of a outdated term, ultra-Orthodox. And the issue at hand is that when we are speaking about the future of the state of Israel, a major player in the Middle Eastern arena, there are many, many factors and many, many issues. However, when it comes to one of the more demographically clear changes within Israeli society is the exponential growth of the Haredi society, of this group of Orthodox Jews who adhere to a, again, using a very simplistic term, a strict lifestyle of religious observance, definitely attend to asceticism, and also a very complex relationship with Western values, Western culture, and Western education. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm interested in and what is the core of this project. So, as I said, Israel is a major regional player. Many things are happening in Israel. And when we're talking about future predictions, we're all academics, we know to take these predictions with a grain of salt. However, with all these caveats, it is clear that the numbers as they are today point to a growing demographic change in Israeli society. As Jewish birth rate has gone up steadily since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, it is also clear that the Jewish population, within the Jewish population, the segment that grows in the fastest pace is the Haredi population. It is the youngest and it has the highest birth rate. In recent years, we have witnessed a change that has been documented by the Israeli Bureau of Statistics. Now, these numbers that the Israeli Bureau of Statistics has given us show several things. First of all, let's talk about the fact that the Haredi community in Israel is right now, based on the definition of the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, ranges about 13% of Israeli population. There is an estimate that by 2065, 40% of Israeli Jews will be Haredi. Now, I am not necessarily standing by that prediction. However, even if we do take this with a grain of salt, a very big grain of salt, it is clear that this community is growing, and it is also clear that it will play a ever-growing part within Israeli society. Now we need to get to the second part of the thesis. Haredi education in Israel has a very tenuous relationship with general education, with non-religious education. As anyone here that studies religion knows, religious institutions and religious orthodoxies have had a tenuous relationship with science. And when it comes to education, within religious orthodoxies, there is always a fear that certain elements that are seen as foreign, Western, are also by definition anti-religious and therefore need to be ousted from the curriculum. Again, nothing unique. The difference here is this: the growing part of Haredim in Israeli society means that a growing part of the population does not have education that seems to be relevant to the modern job market. This is a point of collision within Israeli politics. When the Haredi politicians and the Haredi political parties, political lobby, talk about autonomy and maintaining Jewish identity, and the non-Haredi political parties, mainly from the left, claiming that Haredi education is meant to keep people within the sociological camp because it does not allow them to create economic mobility and therefore social mobility, and is therefore also doesn't comply with the liberal values of the modern state of Israel. Again, as that kind of discourse is not unique, we can compare it to many other. If you deal with the history of education, you can see many models. There are similar discourses we can find in Britain in the 20th century and even the 21st century, other European countries. These are, again, not very unique. We will get to the unique part in a minute. Now, one of the things that seems to take place within Israeli society since the 1980s is a process of cultural acculturation of Haredim into Israeli society. This issue, which has been discussed in scholarship mainly, by Immanuel Sivan, famous sociologist, Kimi Kaplan, another historian of this community, of Orthodoxy in general. They identified a process of acculturation, a process in which Haredi population gets more and more involved within Israeli society, however, does not assimilate but acculturate. In other words, taking part within the Israeli public life, in the Israeli public sphere, while maintaining a very clear sense of disengagement with some of the core values of that society. Now, this process was documented in several public arenas. Now, when it comes to education, it is very pronounced. The resistance to change within the Haredi community, changes in the curriculum, again, is not unique. It uses verbiage we can find in other religious communities, Muslim, Christian, when they need to integrate curricular demands by a secular government. This project, which I am working on with the Mandel Foundation, as part of the research project of the Mandel Foundation, aims to suggest a comparative point of view into the United States and how models of Haredi education in the United States might be beneficial to the Israeli scene. Now, just so you understand what we're talking about demographics, according to the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, In 2020, there were 347,000 students in Haredi elementary and secondary education. We're talking about 19% of the total student body in Israel. Again, remember what I said, there are predictions of this continued growth. Even if we don't talk about 40% in 2065, it is obviously, the trajectory is obviously clear. Second point, 3.5% of these students are now part of schools, which the Hebrew term is Haredi Mamlachti, should be translated as Haredi state approved schools. These are schools which were created about 5 years ago. Right now, they're all located in big cities. These schools are fully funded by the Israeli state that also has a full control over its curriculum. There's a full integration of general studies and religious studies. The cultural atmosphere is Haredi. They are separated by genders. There's boys' schools and girls' schools. Again, right now we are only talking about elementary education. Most of the people going to these schools, you could identify sociologically as modern Haredi. These are Haredim that came from the system, however, went through a certain process of acculturation, and are interested in, on the one hand, maintaining a Haredi identity to one degree or another, but also offering their children a full-fledged secular education curriculum. Right now, 3.5%. What does the future hold for that segment? Hard to know, but definitely something to keep an eye on. But let's assume this will grow in a pace of in which Haredi education grows. Let's say this continues to grow, but the other segments, the other parts of Haredi education grow in a higher pace. So what are the other parts? So 74.5% of Haredi students attend a recognized and unofficial school. Again, the Hebrew official legal term is Mukar Lo Rishmi. These are schools which get some financial support from the Israeli government. There is a more limited control over the curriculum. Again, separated by gender. Most of these schools do offer some kind of general studies. Most of the female students attend these schools. There is also the exempt institutions. They receive almost no support. There's no, even though officially there should be curricular supervision, there is effectively no supervision. Most of the students here are boys. There's, again, here, no real secular education to speak of. Definitely, if there's little in the elementary level, nothing in the secondary level. So, what can we say about Haredi students? And let's go to the numbers that are of the most interest. In 2019 and 2020, 37% of Haredi secondary education students sat for the high school matriculation exams. 8% achieved scores that made it possible to be admitted to higher education institutions. Now, truth be told, there are pathways, like in the United States, in which you can get into higher education institutions even without the official pathways that require these the high school matriculation exams. So what we should use is that the 8%, even if it is not as big as an obstacle to higher education acceptance as we might initially think, it still shows you how limited the general education curriculum is within those institutions. Now, let's talk about numbers which might be more beneficial on the policy level. In 2019, 2020, we're talking about 13,000 Haredi students in higher education. It's only 4% of the entire student population in these institutions in Israel. However, there has been, when you look comparatively between 2009 and 2020, there has been a rise of 180% in the amount of Haredi education, meaning there's no doubt that there's a growing interest within the Haredi community in higher education. When I say higher education, the numbers are very clear. They're all what we would call, quote unquote, practical degrees. In other words, degrees that either translate immediately to a very clear option in the job market, law school, nursing, PA, um, um, architecture, etc. There's more to discuss, and there's more numbers about attrition rates, but again, we don't have time for that. Point is, clearly these numbers show there's an interest. Now, why is the American model relevant? There are striking similarities between the background factual conditions of the Haredi education in Israel versus the Haredi education, the Haredi communities in the state of New York. I will just name a few, the most striking ones. Very similar legal framework. Legally, in New York and in Israel, there's a demand of curricular supervision over institutions which are private institutions. In both situations, we're talking about the existence of a political lobby that is highly sensitive to any kind of intervention by the state in the curriculum. Both places show a status quo that has lasted for decades. In Israel since 1948, in the United States since the late 50s, in which the state says, we don't want to intervene here, or doesn't say it, but doesn't intervene. Both places have a very strong political criticism concerning this reality. In Israel, from the secular political parties, mainly from the left, but also you can see that on the right. In the United States, this is also a political issue. Just for an example, about a month ago, in a debate among the many mayoral candidates for the position of the mayor of New York in the Democratic Party, this was one of the debate questions. Many of the candidates said that the city should intervene, except for Mr. Andrew Young, a libertarian and leading candidate, that said parents should have the ability to decide what their kids learn. Goes to show this is, again, a issue which has political ramifications and is on the horizon of political leaders. Again, very similar between the US and Israel. As far as a very important point of comparison, Social Security benefits. In Israel, with big chunks of the Haredi population, big parts of the Haredi population enjoy income from Social Security, which enables families to stay within the Haredi community, maybe the father not working but studying full-time within religious seminaries for his entire life, and sustaining a family on a combination of a wife working to one degree or another and Social Security benefits. There is also a Social Security benefits reliance structure in the United States, to a lesser degree perhaps. This is something which is hard to quantify, but it does exist. And that difference between the higher level and the lower level is, of course, extremely important. The last point, which is, there's a big difference here, is quality of life expectation or lifestyle expectations. In the Israeli Haredi culture, you can see a very clear push for decades within the education system, within the larger culture, that promotes a life of asceticism and definitely critique of materialism. That is changing in Israel. Again, there's literature on this issue. In the United States, because of these communities are at the center of the most consumer-oriented society probably the world ever saw, the quality of life expectations are extremely different. Now, what does that do? In what I did, I've conducted field research within one of the bigger communities, Haredi communities in the New York area. Generally speaking, we can talk about maybe three big centers of this community. Certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn, New York, like Flatbush, like Williamsburg, New Jersey a little bit, in Orange County, There's a very big community in Lakewood, New Jersey, and a very big community in Muncie, New York. I did field work in Muncie, New York. This field work was qualitative and not quantitative. The qualitative focusing on interviews with stakeholders, from teachers, principals, students, community leaders. The field work brings about three models of integration of general education and religious education. The first model I would like to deal with is the Litvish model. Litvish is, in this case, is a Yiddish word, literally translated Lithuanian. These are Orthodox non-Hasidic communities. Sociologically, they would be communities that use English either exclusively or for the most part. The clothing would be more modern suits. They will wear back hats. This is a community which, when I look at in the Muncie context, created a model of integration beginning in the first part of the 20th century. Now, there are Litvish communities which follow the Israeli model, but these will be found in Lakewood, not here. Now, the Litvish model that we can see in Brooklyn, we can see in Muncie, are institutions that have a very clear educational pedagogical agenda. First and foremost, these institutions want graduates who will be Torah scholars. Now, the fact that most of their graduates will not be is sometimes overlooked, quite intentionally. Now, that being said, even though it's overlooked, even though it's not part of the pedagogical agenda, the majority of these institutions do include secular studies, again, in the Muncie, Brooklyn area, not in Lakewood, but in Muncie and Brooklyn. They send a very complex message. Sometimes there's definitely, to a certain degree, a confrontation concerning secular studies. A significant number of these graduates do pursue finish fulfilling all their curriculum demands in the state of New York, what we call the Regents exam in New York. And many of them, again, hard to gauge the numbers. I was doing qualitative work, not quantitative. As far as I know, there are no clear quantitative numbers. But from interviews, it seems that many, maybe the majority, go to some kind of academic training, maybe not. It's very hard to gauge how much it is, but again, a significant part do go and pursue academic studies. What do I mean by they pursuing academic studies? In the past 10 to 15 years, this requires a little bit more research. It could be that it even started 20, 25 years ago. Haredi schools started to, the Haredi community in the United States started to create pathways for higher education. Now, how does that work? And this is a very interesting part in the findings. Colleges, mainly non-Jewish colleges, mainly Catholic, religious Christian institutions, who were interested in getting more students and more tuition, and on the other hand, were very comfortable with the religious community and religious sensitivities, created specific programs for bachelor's degrees to yeshiva students, yeshiva being the religious seminary for men in Israel, in Orthodox circles, seminary being the equivalent to women. These institutions started to give credits for the religious studies, some credit for the religious studies that post-secondary study of Haredi students, and gave the opportunity for an accelerated path. It could be a year, it could be 2 years, to a BA. Generally speaking, these programs started with business management, again, very practical issues. This has been going on, again, at least 15 years, perhaps more. In recent years, we are starting to see state schools in New York, CUNY institutions, City University of New York institutions, which are implementing this strategy, specifically Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn. being a prime example, Empire State College being another, a few in New Jersey. These programs, which are generally speaking heavy on online education, would aggregate academic credits from prior experience. It could be APs, CLEPs, which are another equivalent of AP exams, and credits from the religious studies, and in a calendar year or or a year and a half will finish the degree. Some of these programs today are integrate. There are religious programs that integrate in the morning religious studies. These are mainly for women in the morning, and in the afternoon academic studies in with local universities, private and public, in their premises. For example, in one program in Brooklyn, quite a large one, the women study religious studies for in the morning. In the afternoon, in the same building, have classes which are geared towards a BA in nursing. So this is one model that is definitely been around for a while and has showed success. Let's talk about the second model I found in the Monsey area, the Chabad model. Chabad being a community which is Hasidic, however, much more open to the outside world, and runs its life mainly in English rather than Yiddish. In this case, the Chabad institutions for men at this point in time, secular education is rare. Many times when secular education is integrated in Chabad institutions for men, it is seen as a solution for students in secular education, in secondary education, which have certain difficulties, spiritual problems. That would be the term that was used in the interviews. On the other hand, in the secondary education for girls in Chabad institutions, like Litvish institutions, there is a robust secular education program. Regents curriculum is adhered to, and many of them offer advanced AP classes. There is a dissonance here. This in the Chabad context, there is a dissonance. On the one hand, objections to secular studies. On the other hand, there are obvious reasons to say that this is more sociological than ideological. There is a growing tendency among graduates of Chabad institutions to pursue academic training, again, in programs that offer practical degrees. You will find Chabad students not only in the specialized programs I mentioned before that started in the Litvish community. It seems that many of the graduates of Chabad institutions are comfortable going to secular colleges to one degree or another. Again, there is a very little quantitative data on this issue. The last model in Monsey is the Hasidic model. Hasidic model, in this case, I'm talking about communities which run their lives mainly in Yiddish. The first language of the people in this community is Yiddish. English is the second language. Sometimes it is quite pronounced, the fact that English is the second language. This could be third generation in the United States, but still English would be somewhat broken. The level of insularity in this community is much, much higher, and the objection to secular education is much higher. Here, it seems that the model that in the United States has been the most successful, and this here, by the way, again, the gender differences are also relevant here, even though it seems that they do not adhere to the region's curriculum, even for the girls' institutions. Here, it would seem that the most relevant trajectory, which seems to be which seems to be of interest to leaders in this community in the Monsey area, is vocational training. By vocational training, I am referring to very clearly to manual labor skills. These are skills which can translate to work. It would translate maybe immediately to work, but it will not translate into any kind of an academic surrounding. That seems to be the core issue here, a non-academic surrounding. Um, the examples that that came up in interviews would be a technician works, repairing ovens, repairing refrigerators, repairing AC system or HVAC, working in welding, etc. Manual labor was the core. And it seems that this kind of training would be celebrated mainly after marriage life, meaning after and this is most of the conversation will about men, women, generally speaking, do not work in these communities or work very rarely. So this is mainly something that it seems that the community is willing to negotiate concerning men, specifically after marriage. Why? Because that means they're more committed to the lifestyle and the value system, and therefore, even if they are venturing outside the boundaries of the community, they will come back at the end of the day, quite literally. Now, the field work here showed that the Hasidic community was not able to create institutions like that for themselves. The people that did try used secular programs. Most common one would be BOCES, which is a federally and state-sponsored program which exists all over the United States, offering these kinds of vocational training. And it would seem that if there was a program that would be more culturally sensitive, and it would garner more interest among that inside that community. I think I'm almost out of time, so let me just conclude. The American model shows that the deep tension in Israel can be circumvented by a political dialogue that would, on the one hand, allow curricular autonomy to Haredi institutions, will create culturally sensitive structures for Haredi students. Some of these already exist in Israel, at least in the higher education level, and will focus on practical programs that translate to the job market. That seems to be a language that is extremely palatable to the Haredi community. The fact that within the Israeli political system, among many of the Israeli politicians that talk about the need to reform higher education, talk about the fact that it needs to allow passive acculturation and acceptance of Israeli values of democracy and liberalism. That kind of rhetoric is obviously rejected forthwith. A rhetoric that focuses on practical programs seems to be much more relevant. So perhaps the 2 points which are might prove useful to alleviate some of the sociological problems would be to utilize two avenues. So beyond the fact that these models, beyond the fact that these models show that there is a willingness to cooperate, when again it doesn't seem as a culture war within the Israeli spectrum, it could be that the institutions, again, it's hard to find Litvish institutions in Israel that will integrate secular studies, but utilizing technology here might be part of the solution. The growing role of the internet in the Haredi community, even though it is highly criticized by its leadership, perhaps allows to give access to students to courses and coursework outside the physical structure of the Haredi institutions. Again, that would solve to alleviate some of the dissonance. Because again, part of the dissonance is this is a religious seminary. There shouldn't be secular studies here. A big part of this Haredi discourse. So using technological tools to allow work outside the physical structure, to create a dissonance, actually it creates a dissonance in the sense that student, family, the society can say, okay, the religious purity is there, is preserved. What you do in the afternoon at 4 or 5 studying math, that's outside that. That's a hobby. That's fine. It doesn't intervene with the religious education. And the second thing, perhaps using time outside the academic year. That's a little bit more relevant in the United States, where the summer vacation is much longer, and students in the Haredi education get a long summer and go to a long summer vacation. In Israel, generally speaking, many of the Haredi students have a much shorter summer vacation, but again, it is a possibility. So this project clearly shows that if there is a discourse that will focus on um, vocational training, or training which is seen as purely professional and not ideological, aka most of liberal arts, um, there is a pathway forward. It would definitely require. It will not give the critiques of higher education everything they want. Far from it, but it seems to be the most feasible path forward, and um, the most feasible way to ensure that a growing segment within Israeli population has options in a job market, uh, which is becoming more and more sophisticated on the one hand, and at the same time, also in a segment in society, in Israeli society, which is slowly but surely slipping away from its ethos of asceticism and celebration of anti-materialism into a more capitalistic frame of reference. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Hi, Ilan. Thank you so much for your panel. And does anybody have any questions? Unfortunately, our other two panelists were unable to attend, so Ilan will be standing by for questions from anybody in our chat. One question I would like to just forward, you spoke a little bit about the role of technology and the use of the internet outside of the educational environment, and how might that improve over time with our recent crisis pandemic, and how education has transformed over the last year? How might that improve in Israel, and do we have any indication that is the case at this time?
So, uh, there's definitely a lack, and this is something which is quite interesting. When it comes to numbers, there is generally speaking, a lack of good quantitative work on Israeli society. There's a lot of qualitative work, but quantitative work, there's definitely a lack. The Israeli Bureau of Statistics does work. That's usually what most sociologists use. When we talk about, for reasons which are should be research in of itself, Israeli universities, Israeli sociological departments usually fund qualitative work, not quantitative work. So there are some indications that the pandemic has caused major changes. The internet has been a issue of strife within the Haredi community for the past 2 decades. More and more Haredim have access to technology, to the internet. However, this is still something which is not it's not a subject you would discuss in civilized society, quote unquote, within the Haredi public sphere. Um, Schools, the Haredi schools in Israel during the pandemic, for a while, for several months, used phone as a way of teaching, which, as anyone has anything to do, ever been in a classroom knows, has very limited capabilities when it comes to education. Um, that is part of the reason in the Haredi community that was the first place to um, sometimes without authorization open the schools back, because of uh, the unwillingness to use the internet and as a path for educational work. Now, that is a battle that's being fought, but is also slowly being lost because there are more and more and more examples of Haredim in the periphery of the community that are using it. Again, internet is everywhere, even though it's not spoken of. It is everywhere, even though it's again in the public life completely disregarded. There are even initial case examples in Israel of Haredi courses online that target secondary education. So we're definitely seeing that. Um, Technology is going to be part of the solution here. It is an uphill battle, but you can even win uphill battles. At the end of the day, the fact that in the Haredi society is growing all the time, on the one hand, that less people are, it is a fact that the religious elite, the religious leadership elite, not everybody can achieve that goal, even though that is culturally celebrated. Uh, what do you do with everybody that doesn't have the skill set to become this maverick um, um, in the religious studies? And the final part is what you are also dealing with a society that's changing its cultural references when it comes to materialism. From a society that was celebrated asceticism, you are starting to see, slowly but surely in the past few decades, past 2 decades, a change and an interest in within the Haredi society in the finer things in life, which of course requires financial resources. So the quantitative data we do have shows that this is the pathway. The real questions we need to ask is what will be the pace of change?
Excellent. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'm just interested if you could give us an idea of where do you think your research is going to go in the next 5 to 10 years. Obviously, studying these models in specifically around New York and how it compares to Israeli society at this time. Do you see yourself continuing your research in this area? Do you have something specific that you're looking at that you would like, perhaps more qualitative studies in the future?
So the what I'm working on now in the next month, now that the field work is done, and now that again the theory is not very complicated. Everybody deals with history of education and sociology of education. The framework is very clear, and these are very basic questions. So that the part I'm dealing with now is talking about perhaps some list of recommendations that would be relevant to Israel, and by the way, also to the United States, because again, in the United States also, we're not talking about, again, this is still an issue, as I mentioned, issue which is hotly politically debated. Just last month, as I mentioned, this was a topic, a question in the mayoral debate in the Democratic Party. Um, and there is a very vocal organization in the New York area called Yafed, which is mainly populated by people who grew up in the Haredi community in the United States and left it, in which they call to increase um, the oversight over these schools. And again, these are issues which, again, there is a long case law history of the relationship between private schools and the state. In this case, most Haredi schools in New York do adhere by these regulations because, again, in the Litvish institutions outside Lakewood, you can find secular education, you can find, generally speaking, again, from the numbers we have, the results are as good and many times much better than the public schools. You can find, again, Regents exam and the Regents exam and even AP classes, because again, a big chunk of the students do join higher education in this model. Chabad, we are starting to see changes again, slowly. There, in these institutions, what we are starting to see and what I'm interested in is talking about how my my recommendation, I started with recommendations about that community. It seems very, very logical that utilizing technology, because this is a community which is much more open to technology, um, would be a way to create this dissonance. Your yeshiva, your seminary, your religious institution is your religious institution. We're going to use technology where you're in the afternoon, you're going to come home, you're going to take your math class. You're going to be in a your religious education will stay in its purity, and you'll do this. This is something you do in the afternoon. It's creates this dissonance, which allows you to maintain both of these ethos of education and religious education. And again, this is a community which is much more comfortable with technology. That would be that's where the recommendation for this community um, is going. The last part, the Hasidic part, and again, this is probably the place where the most work needs to be done, because this is a very insular community. In the United States, these communities again run only in Yiddish. Public life is only in Yiddish. Uh, Private life is in Yiddish. And English is again second language. You can find people that their English is quite broken. There, there's a need for creation of vocational training. This is true for the U.S. But in and definitely I think will work also in Israel. The willingness to specifically vocational training, reasons are obvious. Even if you have very limited secondary education, you can achieve a very high level of proficiency with these vocational trainings. We're talking about manual labor skills, be it welding, be it being a technician that fixes appliances, etc. The translation to the job market is extremely easy, very, very clear. And their recommendations, again, almost write themselves. In the United States, these options exist, again, through the federally and state-sponsored BOCES system, which exists in all 50 states. There, of course, the issue would be, because this is a very insular community, there will need to be a model that would be created that would be culturally sensitive. I don't believe that's necessarily going to be very easy to cooperate with BOCES, which is again is a federal and state funded entity, but it would be very easy to, or should be relatively doable to create a Hasidic model of BOCES that would offer these programs. Um, there, the issue being, again, these will be, again, this is a community which is very insular, and women will, generally speaking, not will have less of an access, at least initially, to these things. It will be interesting to see if there could be also some social changes because of that opens. And that is something which I believe can also be translated to Israel quite easily. At the end of the day, plumbers are needed all over the world, and I think we can all agree, plumbers get paid really well, probably many better than college professors.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Elon, for your panel today, and I'm sure our attendees appreciate it as well. Many of them are writing in the chat at this time, thanking you for your presentation. And I would encourage our attendees to reach out to Elon via email if you have any further questions regarding his research. And we thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elon.